Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
At Dad's retirement party, they toasted my younger brother Jake for carrying the family name. I was in the kitchen, silently helping Marla lay out the cake plates. The room was loud with laughter and the clink of bourbon in highball glasses, the air thick with nostalgia, fake sentiment, and the type of pride that only gets passed around when everyone's a little too drunk and just old enough to pretend they don't regret things. Jake was standing by the fireplace, beaming in his navy blue blazer, shaking hands with Dad's old coworkers, all of them slapping his back like he was the one who'd just wrapped up 38 years at the paper mill. I remember watching it happen in slow motion, Jake raising his glass as Uncle Dean started the toast. My father, standing beside him, nodding ever so slightly, like he was giving permission for the words to land. To Jake, Dean said, for keeping the Hargrave name alive, for taking over the business, for showing up. There was a pause after that, just long enough to sting. He's the kind of son any man would be proud of. I didn't drop the cake knife, but I gripped it hard enough to leave a ridge across my palm. No one looked at me. No one ever did when the air got heavy like that. And maybe that was the worst part, not the omission, but the silence. I wasn't mad at Jake, not really. He'd always been charming, always had that shine to him. Even when he wrecked Dad's truck at 19 or dropped out of college for a year to find himself in California, he managed to walk back into the house like nothing had ever gone wrong. Meanwhile, I was the one who handled the insurance claim, found the replacement truck, and paid part of the deductible from my savings. I was 23 then, living off peanut butter and student loans. But you don't get to be the golden child unless someone else volunteers to be invisible. I didn't want to make a scene. That was never my way. So, I handed out slices of German chocolate cake like a good daughter and smiled at people who didn't remember my name. I answered the same questions over and over. Yes, I still live in Columbus. Yes, still single, no kids. And yes, I still work in HR, human resources, that quiet department nobody understands, but somehow needs. Ironic, really. What stood out to me that night, more than the speeches and the toasts and the tired small talk, was the coat. Dad's old brown wool coat. He wore it every winter since I was a kid, the kind with a suede collar and too many pockets. I noticed it hanging on the back of the dining room chair, his chair, the one with the worn-down armrest and a squeak if you leaned too far to the left. It looked out of place. Not because it was winter in Ohio and people wore coats indoors, but because it was open. And inside the breast pocket, half tucked, was a cream-colored envelope. No name, no address. Just the sharp edge of something deliberate. I didn't touch it. God knows I wanted to, but something stopped me. Maybe it was instinct, or just that old reflex of not messing with Dad's things. Growing up, even looking through his drawer for a pen felt like trespassing. But I kept my eye on it the rest of the night. No one else noticed it. Or if they did, they didn't let on. The party stretched until almost midnight, and I stayed longer than I meant to, mostly out of obligation. Jake was holding court near the liquor cabinet, telling stories that had more shine than truth. He even told the one about the day he saved the plant by fixing a conveyor belt during a mechanical failure. I was there. He didn't fix anything. I did. He was hungover in the break room. But he told it well, and people laughed, and Dad didn't correct him. Later, as the crowd thinned and the laughter dulled to a buzz, I started cleaning up the cups and paper plates, moving through the room like furniture. Jake passed me on the way to the bathroom and gave me a wink, like we were sharing some private joke. I didn't return it. Marla found me in the kitchen wiping counters that didn't need wiping. She touched my shoulder, soft and brief. "You okay, baby?" she asked. That was her thing. Always asking the question, but never sticking around for the answer. I nodded, like I always do. She smiled and went to refill the cheese tray, even though the party was over. I realized then that I could vanish in that house and no one would notice until the trash bags started piling up. When I finally left, the coat was gone. The envelope too. At 1:04 in the morning, I got the text from Jake. Just one line. "What did you say to Dad? He's been in his study for hours." I didn't reply. I sat there staring at the screen, the glow lighting up my dark bedroom, wondering how a night filled with so many words could end with a silence this loud. And here's the thing, I didn't say anything to Dad. But maybe I did something. Something small, quiet, intentional. And, depending on what happens next, it might just be the loudest thing I've ever done. When I saw Jake's message pop up on my screen at 1:04 in the morning, I was already lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, tangled in that strange, familiar feeling I always get after I've spent too long in that house. Somewhere between tired and hollow, like a balloon left under a desk for days after a party, still holding its shape but with nothing inside. The message wasn't long, it didn't have punctuation, and it wasn't laced with any warmth, but it carried weight in that way only Jake's messages ever did, like he'd already decided I had done something. And now it was just a matter of how much damage I'd caused and whether it could be contained before it bled into his carefully curated version of our family story. What did you say to Dad? He's been in his study for hours. Not, did you talk to Dad? Or, do you know what's wrong with him? Not even, is everything okay? Just a direct accusation tucked into a question, the way only someone who's used to being protected by the truth, or the illusion of it, knows how to do. He didn't need evidence. He didn't need details. He just needed to believe that I'd opened my mouth and cracked something open that should have stayed sealed. The thing is, I hadn't said a word. Not to Dad. Not to Jake. Not even to Marla, who floated through the night like a half-deflated parade balloon herself, keeping her smile wide and her eyes away from anything that might make the evening feel less than perfect. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't made a scene, hadn't even so much as cleared my throat when that ridiculous toast happened and everyone turned toward Jake like he was the one who'd held that house together through decades of silence, discipline, and the kind of quiet, emotional starvation you can only fully recognize once you've grown up and found your own voice. But I had seen the envelope. That cream-colored envelope with no writing, half-tucked into the inner pocket of Dad's coat, had etched itself into my memory the way certain things do when your body knows they matter before your brain has caught up. I didn't need to open it. I didn't need to read it. I just needed to know that it existed, and that Dad had brought it with him to a party he clearly didn't want to have, on a night when he was supposed to be celebrated, but had instead stood in the corner like a wax figure while his son accepted congratulations for work he hadn't even done. I thought about texting Jake back, but what was I supposed to say? That I hadn't spoken to Dad, but maybe I'd stood too close to the coat for too long? That maybe I'd stared at the envelope a little too hard, like I was trying to melt it with my eyes? That maybe, just maybe, Dad had noticed that for once in my life, I wasn't playing along? Because here's the truth Jake has never had to understand. I was raised in that house too, and while he was being cheered on for his natural charm and forgiven for his loud mistakes, I was the one moving behind the scenes, cleaning up the messes, keeping the books balanced, answering the phone when Dad's coworkers called and he didn't want to talk, and quietly absorbing the truth that being helpful was never going to be enough to earn love if you weren't born wearing the right face. I sat there in the dark thinking about all the times I'd bitten my tongue for the sake of peace, like the day Jake forged Dad's signature to withdraw money from his college fund so he could fly to Denver with a girl he barely knew. Or the time he lied about losing the shop's credit card when he'd actually maxed it out buying a sound system for his apartment. I kept quiet then too. I fixed things. I made calls. I pulled strings. I protected the name he now gets praised for carrying. And maybe that's why the envelope had rattled me so much. Because for all my years of staying quiet and stepping aside, I never imagined there might be something in writing, something permanent, something real, that didn't fit the narrative Jake and Dad had built together. I hadn't said a word at the party, but I had been thinking things I hadn't allowed myself to think in years. Things like, what if Dad's proud of the wrong child? What if there's something in that envelope that proves he knows I've been there all along? What if he's known the whole time and just never had the guts to say it? I got out of bed and walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stood there in the cold air without taking anything out. The light was sharp and made everything feel too clear, like my thoughts were suddenly under interrogation. I closed the door slowly and leaned against the counter, still holding my phone, rereading Jake's text like it might reveal something new the third or fourth time around. But the truth was, the message wasn't about Dad. It was about Jake. It always was. He was worried not because Dad was upset, but because if I'd said something, if I'd pointed out the cracks, it meant the version of the story he'd told so many times might finally come apart. He didn't want to lose Dad's approval. He wanted to keep the legend intact, the one where he was the son who took over the family business, who made Dad proud, who fulfilled some unspoken masculine legacy. So I didn't respond. I turned off my phone and went back to bed, lying stiff and awake, eyes wide in the dark, wondering, not for the first time, what it would look like if I finally told the truth. Not out loud, not in a scene, but in the quiet way I always have. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a family like mine is nothing. And maybe that night, that's exactly what I'd done. Or maybe I'd finally done something that actually mattered. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones when you've spent a lifetime managing other people's messes without ever receiving recognition, not because you wanted applause or gold stars, but simply because you hoped, somewhere deep down, that someone might notice the way you've kept the wheels turning while everyone else took the credit. And the kind of fatigue I felt the morning after the retirement party wasn't the kind you sleep off or sweat out with a jog. It was older, heavier, and shaped by years of silence, of waiting for a seat at a table that was never built with you in mind. I woke up with a stiffness in my jaw from clenching my teeth all night, my phone still dark on the nightstand, Jake's unanswered text hovering like a fog over everything else I touched that morning. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get when you live alone, not peaceful, not serene, just an absence of sound that amplifies the thoughts you'd rather ignore. I made coffee I didn't want, stared out the kitchen window at a yard I hadn't mowed in weeks, and tried to ignore the feeling creeping up the back of my neck, the one that told me something had shifted, even if I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had changed. I didn't go to work that day. I called in sick, which was rare for me, rare enough that my boss, Linda, asked twice if everything was all right, and when I said it was just fatigue, she paused long enough to let me know she didn't quite believe me, but respected me enough not to push. I've always been the dependable one, the one who picks up slack without complaint, who sends follow-up emails, remembers birthdays, and keeps chocolate in the drawer for coworkers who cry in the supply room after bad breakups. But that day, I didn't want to be dependable. I wanted to sit in the discomfort, to let the ache have space, to stop managing everyone else's experience and let myself unravel for once. Around noon, I drove to the pharmacy, not because I needed anything, but because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't my kitchen, and because walking down aisles full of toothpaste and foot cream is sometimes the only way to feel like a person again. I was standing near the allergy meds, pretending to read a label, when my phone vibrated again. Jake. Just one word this time, Ellie. I stared at the screen without opening the message. There was no apology, no warmth. Just my name, like an accusation or maybe a warning, and I realized then that he wasn't worried about Dad's feelings, he was worried about control. Jake had always known how to control a room, how to read Dad's moods, how to pivot when things turned sour, and most importantly, how to rewrite history just fast enough that no one could catch him in the act. And maybe what scared him now wasn't that I'd done something, but that for the first time in our lives, I might stop doing what I'd always done, protecting him. On the drive home, I passed the church we used to go to when we were kids, the red brick building with the crooked wooden sign that always had some slightly judgmental Bible verse on it, and without thinking, I turned into the parking lot and pulled into the same spot we used to fight over every Sunday morning. I sat there for a long time, staring at the chipped paint on the railing, remembering the mornings Jake would be late, hair wet from the shower, tie still in his lap, while I helped Marla carry the casseroles for the after-service potluck. Never once asked if I wanted help or if I minded being invisible. I thought about all the things I'd kept quiet about, the time Jake forgot to pick up Dad from his doctor's appointment because he was too drunk to drive, and I drove across town during my lunch break to get him, telling Dad that Jake had car trouble. The time Jake used the company credit card to buy a weekend in Nashville for some girl who ghosted him halfway through, and I made the call to the accounting guy Dad trusted, smoothing it over with a lie about a conference mix-up. The time Jake almost got arrested for punching a guy outside a bar, and I called Aunt Nina, who knew someone on the force, and somehow it all went away. I never asked for thanks. I didn't want to rub it in. But it wore me down, chipped away at something I couldn't quite name until it was nearly gone. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove to Marla's house. She was sitting on the porch in her gardening gloves, dirt under her fingernails, pruning a sad little hydrangea that hadn't bloomed properly in years. She looked up, surprised but not unhappy, and waved me over like we were just two women catching up, not mother and daughter dancing around a minefield of unspoken truths. I sat down beside her, and we talked about the weather, the garden, the new neighbors with the yappy dog, and for a moment, it felt almost normal. But then I asked her, without warning, "Did Dad ever tell you what he was planning to say at the party?" She blinked, held her shears still, and said, "What do you mean?" I pressed, carefully, "Did he write anything? A speech, a note? Did you see him with an envelope?" She shook her head slowly, the way she does when she's not sure if the truth will cause more harm than silence, and said, "Your father's not much of a writer, Ellie. You know that." I let it sit. I didn't push. But I saw something flicker in her eyes, hesitation, maybe, or regret, and I knew, in that moment, that she had seen it too. Maybe not the envelope itself, but the weight of something unspoken. And maybe, just maybe, she had chosen not to ask, the same way she had chosen not to ask so many times before. When I left, I didn't hug her. I just nodded, got in my car, and drove away, knowing that I was no closer to understanding what Dad was doing in his study for hours the night before, but that I was closer to something else, something that had been quietly waiting to surface. And as I turned the corner and passed the familiar houses of my childhood street, I thought to myself, maybe the things we don't say are just as loud as the things we do. Maybe louder. It was nearly dusk when I pulled into the long gravel driveway of the house I grew up in, the kind of twilight hour that made everything look softer than it actually was, as if the shadows could hide the edges of all the unfinished conversations and tightly packed memories that seemed to hang in the air around that place like dust that had settled but never been cleaned. The windows of the house glowed a dull yellow through the curtains Marla insisted on washing by hand every spring, and I could already hear the screen door creak in my mind, a sound that hadn't changed since I was 7 years old and too short to reach the handle without using both hands. I hadn't planned on coming over, not really, but something in me, some thick knot of unresolved weight, had pulled me back there after a night of too many questions and too few answers, and even though I had no idea what I was looking for, I knew I wouldn't sleep again until I stepped inside. The porch light flickered once as I climbed the stairs, and I stood there for a moment before knocking, listening for movement, wondering if I was about to walk into another performance of Midwestern pleasantness, where the coffee would be hot and the conversation would be shallow enough to wade through without getting wet. But when Marla opened the door, she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not just physically, but like she'd been carrying something invisible for longer than she knew how to hold it. She didn't smile. She didn't ask questions. She just moved aside and let me in with a kind of quiet understanding that only women like her ever truly learn, women who've been married for decades to men who mistake silence for stability and call it success. The house smelled like lemon furniture polish and old books, and the faintest trace of pipe smoke still clung to the corners of the living room, though I knew Dad hadn't smoked indoors in years. The air felt heavier than usual, and as I walked past the familiar walls lined with school pictures and military medals, I had the strange sensation of being both guest and ghost, present and invisible all at once. Marla disappeared into the kitchen, probably to make tea or pour a glass of wine she wouldn't finish, and I stood there alone in the hallway, facing the closed door of Dad's study like it was the gate to some ancient vault filled with secrets I wasn't supposed to know. It wasn't locked, which somehow surprised me more than if it had been, and as I turned the knob slowly, the door opened with a faint groan, revealing a room that was exactly as I remembered it, overly neat, borderline sterile, filled with maps, binders, and the faint hum of an ancient space heater that had no business still working in this century. The desk was clean, the chair pushed in with military precision, but something was off, a disruption in the usual order that tugged at my attention like a loose thread in an otherwise tightly woven sweater. There, just to the left of the blotter pad where he kept a notepad and a coaster for the coffee mug that always smelled burnt, was a manila folder, open, unguarded, and facing the chair as if it had been left that way intentionally. I hesitated. I didn't want to be the kind of person who snoops, who digs, who violates the unspoken rules of familial distance, but something in the air around that folder felt like an invitation, or maybe a challenge, and before I could think better of it, I stepped forward and looked inside. There was only one sheet of paper, thick stock, not typed, but written in Dad's stiff, all-caps handwriting, the kind he used on blueprints and tax forms, the kind that didn't allow for emotion. At the top of the page, centered and underlined 3 times, was my name, Eleanor Jean Hargrave. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was a list, dates, places, numbers. At first glance, it looked like a ledger, but as I read further, I realized what it really was, a record. A record of every major moment in my life that had cost him something. College tuition payments. The down payment on my first apartment. The legal fees after my divorce. A line that simply read 2013, job at Campbell & Sons, called Paul. My stomach turned. I stood there reading each line like it was a slap I hadn't expected, my breath catching somewhere between my ribs and my throat. It wasn't that I didn't know he kept track of things, he was always the kind of man who measured worth in numbers, but to see it laid out like this, cold and factual, reduced to transactions without context, made something inside me fracture in a way I hadn't prepared for. Because he hadn't just written down the events, he had written down the costs, the effort, the sacrifices. Not out of pride, not out of sentiment, but as evidence, as proof that I had been a burden, even in my best moments. And yet, near the bottom of the page, there was one entry that stopped me cold. It read, October 2022, JH overdraft covered, e-handled. No mention to M. JH. Jake. It wasn't even about me. It was about a mistake my brother had made, one I'd cleaned up, just like always, and apparently one that Dad had known about the whole time. Not only had he known, but he had recorded it, not under Jake's name, not under his list, but under mine. Because I had handled it. Because I had kept it quiet. Because I had protected the story. I sat down in the chair, legs trembling slightly, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape, and I stared at that paper, at the way my life had been condensed into a list of debts and silent sacrifices, and for the first time in decades, I wondered if he had ever truly seen me as his daughter, or just as the insurance policy that kept the family from falling apart. When I finally emerged from the study, the folder back in its place, the room as untouched as when I'd entered, Marla was standing at the bottom of the stairs with a mug in her hands and a look on her face that told me she'd known something had been written, even if she didn't know what it was. She opened her mouth to speak, but I shook my head gently, not out of anger, but out of resignation, and I walked past her with the kind of calm that only comes when you've stopped needing answers from people who don't know how to give them. As I stepped out into the night air, the cold slapped me awake, and I realized I hadn't cried. Not once. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because the grief had calcified into something else, something sharper, something more deliberate, something that didn't need an apology to feel justified. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with what I'd seen, but I knew one thing with more clarity than I'd ever known anything before. Silence wasn't going to save anyone this time. Not me. Not Jake. And especially not Dad. I didn't return to the house for 3 days after I found the folder, though it never left my mind for more than a minute at a time, clinging to my thoughts like a burr caught in the hem of a coat, sharp, persistent, and impossible to shake free. During those days, I moved through the hours with a mechanical rhythm that had once come naturally to me. I went to work, answered emails, smiled in conference calls, remembered to water the sad fern by my kitchen window, and even forced myself to make a real dinner instead of leaning on boxed cereal and toast. But beneath that surface of normalcy, something had shifted in a way that felt irreversible, like someone had rewired the quiet part of my brain where I stored the old family stories, the ones that made me feel rooted, even if I didn't always feel seen. The memory of that single page, my name at the top, the numbers listed below, the strange mix of calculation and confession woven into every line, settled inside me like a fuse that hadn't yet found fire. It wasn't the ledger itself that haunted me, not really. It was the knowledge that he had seen everything all along. Not just the moments that cost him money or the days I stepped in to clean up Jake's wreckage, but the full picture, the invisible labor, the silent loyalty, the weight of being the daughter who never asked for anything but was expected to carry everything. He knew. He had always known. And still, he chose to let the world think Jake was the one who had held the family together. It was Saturday afternoon when I finally drove back, the sky overcast and flat, the kind of gray that presses down on you like a blanket soaked in cold water. I didn't call ahead. I didn't warn them I was coming. I didn't even fully know what I planned to do or say when I got there. All I knew was that I couldn't carry this quiet rage around anymore, not because I needed to punish anyone, but because I needed to let it out before it poisoned me from the inside. The house was still, and I could tell the moment I stepped through the front door that the mood inside was different. Marla wasn't in the kitchen. The television wasn't humming in the background. There was no smell of coffee or bread or lemon oil. It felt like a church after everyone's gone home, that eerie stillness that follows the final hymn. I walked down the hall slowly, past the photographs that now looked like evidence of a life curated to please visitors, and I stopped at the study door, which, for the first time I could remember, wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open just enough to invite me in, and I pushed it gently with my fingertips, expecting to find the room as I had left it, precise, impersonal, and too clean. Instead, I found my father sitting at his desk, still as stone, the light from the green-shaded banker's lamp casting a yellow hue over his face, making the lines around his mouth look deeper, more tired, more human. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't greet me or ask why I had come. He simply sat there, fingers laced together on top of the desk, staring at something I couldn't see, like he had been waiting, not for me, but for a decision only he could make. I stood in the doorway, heart pounding, not with anger anymore, but with the weight of everything unsaid, the years of playing the good daughter, while choking on the knowledge that love in our house had always been earned in ways I wasn't built to perform. I could have spoken then. I could have unloaded everything, the resentment, the disappointment, the ache of being invisible even when I was the one keeping things from collapsing. I could have listed every sacrifice, every lie I'd told to protect his illusions, every moment I'd swallowed the urge to scream while watching Jake soak in praise for things I had orchestrated from the shadows. But I didn't. Instead, I walked into the room slowly, each step deliberate, and sat down in the chair across from him. We didn't look at each other for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us like a thread drawn tight. And then, without turning his head, my father said in a low, almost fragile voice, "You found the folder." I didn't respond. I didn't nod. I just held his gaze when he finally met mine, and in that look, heavy, weary, and more honest than anything we'd ever spoken, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, exactly, and certainly not regret, but a kind of tired recognition. As if he had been carrying this weight too, but lacked the language, or maybe the courage, to ever speak it out loud. He reached for something in the top drawer of his desk, slowly, like every movement cost him more than he wanted to admit, and pulled out a small photograph. It was old, worn at the edges, and I recognized it instantly, a candid shot of me and Jake at the beach when we were kids, maybe 6 and 10, sitting on a cooler while Marla held sandwiches in foil. In the photo, I'm shielding Jake from the wind, holding a towel around both of us, smiling at something just out of frame. Jake's head is on my shoulder. He looks safe. My father laid the photo on the desk, slid it toward me, and said nothing else. He didn't offer explanation or apology. He didn't try to fix anything. He just looked at me like someone who finally saw the whole story, not just the part he had clung to, but the part he had ignored. And maybe that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't. I'll never know. I stood to leave a few minutes later, still without speaking, the photograph tucked into my coat pocket, its corners digging into my ribs like a reminder of something I didn't have words for. As I walked past the study door, I paused and looked back at him one last time. He hadn't moved. He just sat there, staring at the empty space where the photo had been, his hands folded, his mouth a tight line of thoughts he would never say. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, just like I had after the party, but this time, I wasn't waiting for a message or an answer. I wasn't expecting closure. I wasn't even sure I wanted it. Because sometimes, the closest we get to peace is knowing we don't need to prove anything anymore, not to the people who overlooked us, not to the ones who leaned on us without gratitude, and not even to ourselves. Jake never followed up on his message. He didn't text again. He didn't call. Maybe Dad told him something. Maybe he didn't. Maybe the silence between all of us was the answer we'd been circling for years, but never dared to face. I still don't know what the envelope in the coat pocket contained. I never asked. I probably never will. But I know it wasn't just paper. It was weight. It was memory. It was proof that even if he never said it aloud, my father understood what I had done, what I had carried, what I had become. And somehow, in that silence, I finally felt heard.